You know the baby boomers. You know Generation X. You know the millennials. But there is another generation just as large, just as influential, present at every major turning point of the modern era that history almost never names. If you were born between 1954 and 1965, you have likely lived with a strange and persistent feeling. You were always there, yet rarely recognized. Old enough to remember the analog world in full detail, young enough to build the digital one. Present at every major transition, and yet somehow folded into someone else's story, absorbed into the enormous baby boomer category as though your distinct experience had never happened. Demographically, Generation Jones sits at the center of power today. Many of the CEOs, policymakers, and institutional leaders shaping the current world were born in this narrow window. They are, in many ways, the operational core of late 20th and early 21st century leadership, and still, culturally, they remain invisible. When your generational identity is never clearly named, your internal experience goes unconfirmed, blurred into a larger narrative that doesn't quite fit. You weren't missing. You were misclassified, and that eraser leaves a mark. To understand the psychology of Generation Jones, you have to begin with what they were raised to expect. They grew up inside one of the most powerful cultural promises ever constructed. The post-war American dream was everywhere in television, in school guidance, in suburban landscapes taking shape all around them. Work hard, stay responsible, play by the rules, and a stable adult life would follow as naturally as adulthood itself. Upward mobility wasn't an aspiration, it was a norm. Security wasn't something you built, it was something already prepared, waiting for your arrival. Psychologists call the belief that, formed in this environment, anticipated continuity, the deep childhood assumption that society would expand enough to include you when your turn came. The future was not something to fear, it was something already in place. But by the time Generation Jones reached early adulthood, the expansion had stalled. Political trust fractured, economic stability weakened, secure pathways narrowed, housing drifted out of reach. Long-term employment guarantees quietly dissolved. This is where the deepest imprint formed, not in hardship alone, but in timing. They did not grow up expecting struggle. They grew up expecting stability and encountered volatility precisely at the moment. Identity and adult confidence normally consolidated. Psychologists call this structural disorientation. The map you were given still exists, but the terrain has changed. You move forward carrying two incompatible beliefs at once, that life should be stable, and that it may not be. What forms from that rupture isn't a single wound. It accumulates through what psychologists call an expectation scar, different in texture from overt trauma, harder to name, but no less durable. Unlike a defining event, the expectation scar forms through repeated micro-contradictions between effort and outcome, between planning and instability, between anticipation and delay. You followed the instructions. The system quietly declined to honor its end of the arrangement without acknowledging that one had ever existed. The psyche adapts by holding two assumptions simultaneously. The world should reward diligence, and the world may not. That duality settles in and stays. Achievement becomes urgent rather than aspirational. Security becomes something to construct and defend. And beneath competence, a subtle, persistent vigilance. The memory that the ground once shifted, just as adulthood was beginning. If any part of this is landing for you, take a moment to drop a like on the video. It helps more people find conversations like this. And if you're drawn to the deeper psychology of human behavior, consider subscribing. It's the best way to stay connected to this work. Generation Jones stands precisely between two larger generational poles. Classic baby boomers came of age during expansion, when effort and reward aligned often enough to sustain broad cultural optimism. Generation X matured inside contraction, learning early that institutions could fail. Generation Jones was shaped by both messages simultaneously. They had already internalized the expectation of stability too deeply to abandon it. But early adult experience taught them that stability could not be assumed. What emerged was neither cynicism nor enduring optimism. Psychologists describe it as practical cynicism, a recalibrated trust. The desire for security remains strong, often stronger in those who were promised it than in those who never expected it. But those desires are wrapped in protective realism. Plans include contingencies. Effort carries an undertone of vigilance. Work hard, but do not presume the system will meet you halfway. They pursued advancement intensely not only for aspiration, but for insulation. Career progress meant buffering against volatility already witnessed. They still wanted the promise they were raised with. They simply stopped trusting it would arrive on its own. When the expected guarantees of adulthood weakened, achievement shifted from aspiration to something more structural, a way to secure legitimacy in an unstable world. Titles mattered, professional credibility mattered. Being seen as indispensable was the conversion of achievement into safety, anchoring self-worth in what could still be measured and defended when so much else had proven unreliable. Generation Jones also occupies a singular position in technological history, the last cohort to complete childhood entirely in the analog world, and the first required to spend their prime working years inside the digital one. Rotary phones, typewriters, paper systems experienced not nostalgically but as lived reality. And yet they were young enough to be genuinely reshaped by the digital revolution during their most professionally formative years. This created a persistent, adaptive demand. They were expected to retain the procedural rigor of older institutional culture, while absorbing the speed of emerging digital norms, becoming translators between eras, explaining legacy structures to younger colleagues, explaining new tools to older ones. Psychologists call the cumulative weight of this bridge fatigue, the strain of continuous adaptation without full affiliation. Competence is high, anchoring is diffuse. To those above, they could appear insufficiently traditional. To those below, like extensions of the old order, recognition arrived situationally, never stably. The burden of being the link is that the link itself is rarely centered. The same dual inheritance shaped how Generation Jones loved. They inherited relational models from mid-century America, where commitment, provision, and endurance defined partnership. But they built their adult relationships during the economic volatility of the 1970s and 80s. Love was expected to be lasting, but life had already demonstrated that stability could not be assumed. What emerged was a quiet recalibration of how care was expressed. Many learned to translate love into responsibility, providing reliably, remaining present through strain. Emotional restraint was not indifference. It was containment, feelings carried privately so as not to add burden to already pressured systems. Their partnerships were often paradoxical: durable commitment alongside muted intimacy, shared duty alongside unspoken strain. They did not love less. They loved through structure acts, replacing declarations, reliability replacing reassurance. For Generation Jones, partnership was less about expressive romance than mutual holding, two people bracing the same uncertain world and calling that steadiness love. When they became parents, the same dual imprint followed. They encouraged self-expression more openly than prior generations, driven by the quiet wish that doors which had tightened for them might open fully for their children. Yet beneath that encouragement lay persistent anxiety. Having learned security could not be assumed, they moved to engineer it: education, planned early, pathways optimized. The message subtly expanding: you can become anything, but you must remain competitive and prepared. This transfer of vigilance was rarely conscious. Children sensed both currents at once: belief and pressure, freedom and contingency. The expectation scar migrated forward. Generation Jones did not intend to burden their children. They intended to shield them. But when aspiration fuses with inherited anxiety, protection can become indistinguishable from demand. By midlife, many in Generation Jones had achieved what once seemed uncertain: stable careers, leadership roles, financial footholds. Outwardly, this looked like an arrival. Psychologically, It rarely felt that way. Success was experienced less as a permanent state than as a maintained position. Having entered adulthood during contraction, many never fully internalized security even after reaching it. The summit felt provisional, something to protect rather than simply inhabit. Retirement decisions were delayed. Transitions weighed against loss of standing as much as gain of freedom. And in later life, a quiet question surfaces not loudly, but persistently. Was it enough? Not only professionally, but narratively. Did the effort, the adaptation, the endurance finally resolve into the stable adulthood they were promised? Or did they spend a lifetime stabilizing what never fully settled? There is another way to read this story, one that the noise of misclassification has long obscured. Generation Jones did not fail to inherit stability. They carried continuity across rupture. They absorbed systemic change without being destroyed by it, built institutions and families and frameworks that others now inhabit more easily, and did so without a cultural narrative that named what they were doing or why it cost what it cost. Their story is not unfinished because it lacked achievement. It is unfinished because it has rarely been fully named, until now.